in Security of e-Voting in Brazil for Diego Aranha. Esta charla presenta un análisis de seguridad del software de la máquina para votar en Brasil, basado en la participación en test restringidos oficiales organizados en 2012 por autoridades electorales nacionales. Se presentarán escenarios donde estas vulnerabilidades posibilitan el fraude electoral y cómo un enfoque de crowdsourcing fue usado para verificar parcialmente la transmisión de resultados en 2014. Diego Aranha es profesor asistente en el Instituto de Computadoras en la Universidad de Campinas. Tiene un interés especial en la implementación eficaz de algoritmos criptográficos y la seguridad de sistemas reales. Coordinó el primer equipo de investigadores independientes capaces de detectar y explorar vulnerabilidades en el software de las máquinas de votación de Brasil durante test controlados organizados por autoridades electorales.
Hola a todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Es un placer estar acá en Buenos Aires para hablar de voto electrónico. Como pueden ver, mi español es muy malo, entonces voy a cambiar para inglés por precisión. ¿Sí? So hi everyone. In this talk, I will talk about the horribly insecure Brazilian voting system. It summarizes 5 years of my experience dealing with the system and the electoral authority and the processes that compose it. So I will start with some context. Brazilian elections are massive if you compare with other countries in the world. We have more than 140 million enrolled voters, so it's a huge number. Voting is mandatory, which means that 81% of the population or the voting population ends up voting. Elections are held every 2 years, so we alternate between municipal and federal elections. In the 80s and 90s, after the dictatorship ended, we have several reports of rampant fraud. This motivated the electoral authority to introduce electronic voting. The process started in 1996 with a fraction of the poll places, but the total of the poll places switched to electronic voting in the 2000s. So now in Brazil, we have purely electronic voting across the whole country with the same machine. It's very distinctive in the case of Brazil that we have a single institution. It's a government body, a branch of the judicial system we call the Superior Electoral Court. They do everything regarding elections. So they choose the technology to be used. They have a software division to write the software. They conduct the logistics on the election day. So they deploy the machines, they update the software. They have people moving things around on the election day. So they do everything in terms of distributing the machines and collecting the results. And since they are part of the judicial branch, they also get to decide what's the correct outcome in case of any legal dispute. So we have this distinctive property of the same institution controlling everything regarding elections, from the technology to the process and policy parts. I will call this entity just by SEC, to be short, and they will play the role of the comic book villains in this talk. So the Brazilian DRE machines are purely electronic. We use this direct recording electronic systems, so we have no paper record in place. They were claimed to be 100% secure, but were only tested for the first time in 2012 on the Hacking Challenge event in which I participated. I will talk more about this in detail along the talk. The hardware is manufactured by Diebold, following a specification given by the electoral authority. So we have 500,000 voting machines deployed in the country. And you probably know that Diebold doesn't have a good history in terms of voting technology. So in case you are interested, there is a very good documentary called Hacking Democracy by HBO. So please watch it. It's very good to understand how Diebold plays part in elections or played some role in elections across the planet. This software is written by the SEC since 2006. So before that, a subsidiary of the Diebold was responsible for the software. Now the software is the entire responsibility of the electoral authority. They switched from Windows Compact Edition to Linux in 2008. And yes, it's crazy. We had presidential elections through or using Windows Compact Edition. So it's kind of crazy to look in retrospect. In 2002, they first experimented with paper records and concluded that on a fraction of the poll places, I believe 30% of the poll places, and concluded that it was too expensive, too cumbersome, and since the results matched between the paper records and the electronic record at that time, they decided to not implement this in the next elections. The electoral authority is also deploying fingerprint identification for the voters, and they have enrolled more than half of the voting population already. So they expect to finish this in the next decade or so. So in this picture, you can see the Brazilian voting machine. On the left-hand side, you see the election officer terminal. The keyboard there is to type the voter registration number. So the workflow is like this. A voter arrives, the election officer will type his registration number, and optionally, the fingerprint will be collected, will be verified on the reader you can see at the top. On the right-hand side, there is the voting terminal. So voters, after they are properly identified in the election officer terminal, they get a chance to cast their vote in the voting terminal. The first design problem you can see is the two terminals are connected by a cable, which means that at every point in time, the voting terminal knows exactly what's the identification of the voter, what are his choices, and even how his fingerprint looks like, right? So from the point of view of privacy or ballot secrecy, this is not a sensible design decision, but it's how things are. So the system was claimed to be 100% secure until 2012, when I participated in these public security tests. So it was a hacking challenge organized by the electoral authority. It was the second edition, as the name implies, the number implies. The first edition was in 2009, and investigators did not have access to the source code. So at that time, I was not interested into this because I couldn't understand how the machine worked. All the attacks on that edition of the test was essentially hardware attacks, which is not my specialty. In 2012, they announced these security tests with access to the source code. So I became interested and decided to participate. But the public name there is, the label is a little misleading because these were not public tests by any means. We had all sorts of restrictions. To give some examples, we had only 3 days to inspect the source code, which amounts to more than 13 million lines of code, which is humanly impossible to audit and inspect. Actually, all the teams had 3 days to inspect the source code. My team only had 5 hours, because apparently they didn't have enough computers. 2 weeks after this inspection phase of the test, we had 3 days to mount the attacks. In between, we had to formally submit the attacks we wanted to mount. So the electoral authority had a say in which attacks could be followed or not. So they had to be pre-approved. We submitted attacks both against ballot secrecy and integrity, but we only had time to mount an attack against ballot secrecy. That I will describe in more detail. The participants also need to be pre-approved by the electoral authority. I don't know of anyone who was refused to participate, but still they can exercise this option if they see a reason for that. During the tests, we had no guarantees about what version of the software was running. We didn't know if it was actually correct or recent version of the software. We were just given millions of lines of code to inspect without any formal guarantees. And some critical components were missing. We had access to the software, the voting machine software source code, but no access to any software regarding fingerprint identification, transmission of results, network infrastructure. We only had access to the voting machine source code. So the scope is severely restricted. And of course, this whole test is organized by the electoral authority. So this poses an intrinsic conflict of interest. They are organizing a test to evaluate the security of their own equipment. That's why we have so many restrictions. Probably the interest is not really to find out if the system is secure or not. Perhaps it's something else. The objective, as posed by the electoral authority, was to either cause a failure, a sort of denial of service objective, in which voters cannot vote anymore because the system is an inconsistent state, or preferably to make some violation of the security properties of the system, both ballot secrecy or ballot integrity. And of course, such an attempt is better if it doesn't leave any traces. So if it's untraceable, it was better. We actually had scoring criteria for all of this, and I will talk later how good or how bad we scored in our test. So before that, let's briefly summarize how the algorithm for elections in Brazil work. So in between elections, during these 2 years, you have to wait until the next elections. Of course, the electoral authority updates and improves, hopefully, the software, right? Just before the election, they transmit the software from Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. You probably know that it's not Buenos Aires, right? So they transmit the software from Brasilia to their local branches. In the local branches, they record the software into flashcards, and these flashcards are used to install the software in the machines. So a good feature of this, the way the elections are organized, is that you can update the software in between elections. This is good because you can fix vulnerabilities, and it's different from other places in the world where you deploy the machines and they have to stay there for 10 years with the same version of the software. So a few days before the election, the machines are loaded with software. On the election day, between 7 and 8 a.m., the system is initialized by printing the zero tape. The zero tape is a document which supposedly attests that no vote was recorded, was cast, before the voting session formally starts. I say supposedly because, of course, this is a document printed by software. If the software is acting dishonestly, it can cast votes for some candidate and still print a document that gives the appearance that no votes were cast. So we are trusting software to have, of course, this document produced too. At 8 a.m., the voting session opens, so the voters can identify themselves with the election officer, perhaps by their fingerprints, and have access to the voting terminal to cast their votes. This goes on until 5 p.m., when the election officer triggers the end of the voting session by typing a command in his terminal, and then the machine does a few things. It prints a partial result. We call it the poll tape, which is just the amount of votes cast for each candidate on that specific machine. The machine also writes a sequence or a series of files to a pen drive. We call it the media of results. It's an orange pen drive attached to the back of the machine. And these files include an electronic version of the poll tape, a digital record of the vote that I will describe in more detail. So it's a shuffled list of the votes, and a log file with the whole events for that machine during the election. After these files are written to this pen drive, the election officer detaches the pen drive, breaks a seal and detaches the pen drive, connects this pen drive to another machine, and transmits the contents to the tabulator. So the tabulator is responsible for combining all these partial results into the election outcome. So this is fairly similar to any DRE workflow, election workflow you see around the world. It's not distinctive by any way. So they describe it, before this test is started, they described some of the security mechanisms in an opening talk. So they give an overview of how these were implemented. And they describe it in lots of detail, the digital record of the vote. So it's a file, it's a table, it's stored in a file, which has different columns for each race. So in this hypothetical election, we have governor, senator, and president races. And each voter gives options for all of these races, and the positions in which these votes are stored are pseudo-randomly chosen in these columns. So as you can see, this first voter here, he really or she really likes prime numbers, so she voted for 13 and 31. She was not sure about the president, so she gave a blank vote. If the second voter votes like this, he also likes prime numbers. So at the end, if these 3 out of 7 voters vote, their choices are shuffled together. In this particular case, I'm assuming that we had a total of 7 voters, but only 3 of them actually voted. That's why we have 4 empty spaces in each column. In the version of this software we got to examine, these empty spaces were still there on the final version of the file. This is important because it will allow an attack later on, so it's important to recall that. So when they described this mechanism, we quickly observed that probably the implementation required random numbers, right? And this is a common place for developers without training to make mistakes. So we thought that, okay, we should start by inspecting if this mechanism was implemented, designed and implemented in a secure way. So we started our analysis by that. So the history of this file is really strange. So I told you that Brazil experimented with paper records in 2002 and found out to be a bad idea. So instead of having paper records, they decided through a legal device, so this was a law approved by Congress, to have a digital version of the paper records. So the claim is that since you are storing the votes, the choices by the voters in a shuffled way, you can recount the votes to compare, to verify if the electronic counting is accurate or not. Of course, this makes no sense, because both this file and the electronic count are performed by the same software. So if the attacker is capable of manipulating the software, of course, the election will produce matching but manipulated results. So they still claim that this allows recounts, but anytime you recount this, you just get the same result. So this is not a proper recount mechanism. For a mechanism to be a recount, you must have the possibility of arriving to a different outcome. So this doesn't qualify. So if this is not a recount mechanism, what is this? Actually, we concluded that this file provided no additional transparency. It serves no purpose in the system, but only it can fragilize, make ballot secrecy vulnerable if it's not designed or implemented correctly. That was the conclusion after our study. And the horrible thing is, since it's mandated by law, this file needs to stay within the system. You need to change the law to not produce this file. So it's a very interesting example of how there should be limits of law when applying to legislating technological objects. Because perhaps you think when designing a law that this makes sense, and this crystallizes into the code, in the law code, and now you have to fulfill, to comply with this, even though it makes the system less secure. So as I told you, this requires random numbers to generate and maintain. So we thought, let's start for this. Programmers usually make mistakes when generating random numbers. Since I work in cryptography, this is my main research area. I only play with voting systems in my free time. We thought, okay, let's start through advanced cryptanalysis, right? Let's try to cryptanalyze this pseudo-random number generator. So we had 30 million of lines of code that we never saw before, and we had to find where this random number generator was implemented. So the first thing we did when having access to the source code was actually this. So we started by looking through horribly insecure PRNG implementations in the code base. And fortunately or unfortunately, it's hard to decide, we found a match in a file called drv.cpp. So this was a strong indication at that time that actually my heart skipped a bit, because we had this bad PRNG participating somehow in how these positions were chosen, right? So when we took a look at this file, we found this. As you probably can see, this is the well-known and very bad implementation of random number generation from the C standard library. A severe limitation of this generator is it only receives a 32-bit seed, so you only have 4 billion different seeds, and you have a time measurement as the seed. This is a classic mistake, right? It's from the 90s. I think the first time this was actually detected in production software was Netscape 1.1 in 1995. We were inspecting the source code in 2012, so quite a bit of history in between. So then we thought, okay, now we have an attack. Just by looking at this, we figure out we had an attack. You can try the following. If you want to know if a certain seed is possible, it can be the correct one, you seed the generator with an integer and verify that after storing k out of n votes, if the empty places are in the same places, the empty spaces are in the same places as the file you want to attack. If this match somehow, you probably have found out what's the correct seed. And if you have the correct seed, you can recover the votes in order and find exactly how the first, second, third voter voted in sequence, right? So, but there is an additional thing here. When we took a look at this line of code, this was called during the initialization of the system. Remember that I told you that the system must be initialized between 7 and 8 a.m. This gives you actually 3,600 possible seeds. That's the whole space of seeds. And this is important. Reducing the seed space is important because if you have 4 billion seeds, it could be the case that we have more than one matching seed, and then you have to find out what's the correct one. So this actually helped a lot because we only had 3,600 seeds to test. But we actually didn't even have to do this because the seed was printed in a public document and registered in the log file for forever, essentially. So our attack essentially amounted to take hold of the zero tape, take a look at the time it was printed, see the pseudo-random number generator with that timestamp, and figure out how the votes were stored in that file, which gives how the first, second, and third voter and so on voted. So based only on public information. All these files are public. The DRV file is public, made public to the political parties. The zero tape is public. And the log file can also be requested by the political parties. So only with public information we can break ballot secrecy. But notice that we could recover the votes in order, but we still needed extra effort to know exactly who the voters are. But this doesn't look too hard for a malicious poll worker who simply registers who are the voters or the voting sequence, right? The voting query. But there is more. So after this test ended, we found out that the log file also registers a timestamp in which each voter voted. So the first voter voted at 8:15, the second one at 8:30, and so on. And this is very problematic because you can do the following thing. Suppose that you have a famous voter and you know at which time this voter voted, right? For example, the president of the electoral authority. We know that he voted at 11:20 in 2010 because the official picture of him voting, published by the electoral authority, has metadata saying that he voted at 11:20. So if we get this information, we can quickly figure out what was his position on the voting query, right? If we can recover votes in order, it's fairly trivial to recover his specific vote. Of course, we didn't do this for two reasons. It's profoundly anti-democratic, and it gets you to jail really quickly. I'm using the president of the electoral authority as an example because when we were discussing as a country if we should have paper records or not, he gave this fun quote that attaching a printer to a voting machine is just like attaching an analog compass to a fighter jet, equipping a fighter jet with an analog compass. But the funny thing is, all fighter jets have analog compasses. Because as you know, if the electronic systems of the jet fight are in danger or are compromised somehow, you need an analog backup. So it's a fairly contradicting and interesting quote. So after this ended, and the initial repercussions in the press, the electoral authority said that our contribution was extremely positive. They said it was a highly advanced technological attack, which I still can't figure out if this is good or not. And they said they would ask for our help in the next 2 years. I'm still waiting. And they published a report. There was an evaluation committee in this who wrote a report qualifying our attack. So basically they said that our attack was not an attempt at fraud. It was just a denial of service attempt causing failure. And that we needed physical access to the machine, to the media, the media of results, this orange pen drive to recover the files corresponding to a certain election, to the seals, to break the seals, to recover the orange pen drive, and to the code. So this was strange because, of course, during this attack or these tests, we had to simulate an election. And you need physical access to the voting machine to simulate an election. I can't do this at a distance. So we only needed access to these things to simulate an election. So this entered into the scoring criteria they had back then. And essentially, the more access you needed, the more penalized your score was. So we ended up with the score of 0.0313, which is really low, really, really low. It's the lowest score I ever had in my life, in a range between 0 and 400. I still have problems with failing students this day because they say, okay, professor, I need only this to pass. Can you give me this? And it's really a small amount. So, and the most worrying thing I would say is we were penalized because we analyzed the source code. But I thought that the whole point of this was checking if the source code had proper or not security mechanisms implemented. So it's fairly contradicting. So just to summarize, we concluded that it was trivial to recover the votes in order. So a malicious poll worker could break the ballot secrecy for all voters in a poll place. We did this up to 475 voters who voted for 2 races, so 950 votes. This is a realistic amount of votes for the typical size of a poll place. And we also found trivial to recover a specific vote cast in a specific moment in time. So our recommendation back then was eliminate this file. This file serves no purpose. It only damages ballot secrecy if it's not properly implemented. And do not store any metadata about the voters. That's the sensible design decision for protecting ballot secrecy. So instead of following our advice, the electoral authority fixed this by using dev urandom, that you probably know it can be very problematic in embedded systems due to predictable initial states. Although the voting machine has 2 hardware RNGs, so a substantial portion of the voting machines have a dedicated hardware module with a TRNG implemented in hardware, and the processor in these machines is an AMD Geode, which also has hardware RNG. So I don't understand why sticking to a software RNG instead of using the ones they already bought. So another fun quote regarding this is, during the discussions about implementing paper records or not, the next president of the electoral authority said that paper records would actually damage ballot secrecy, and the system already had a shuffling mechanism that guaranteed ballot secrecy. So again, this is another damaging situation where law and tech have a strange interplay. By considering that the mechanism was properly implemented, policy decisions are taken. But when you look at the detail and see that the technical mechanism actually is badly flawed, well, it's hard to continue to support this argument. So other things we observed in the system. We found lots of bad engineering practices. On the machine, we use it to inspect the code. We found the username and password of a developer. This machine didn't have access to the source code repository because it was offline, but it could have been interesting to be able to modify the official repository under the credentials of a legitimate developer. Probably gets you in jail too. We didn't try. The machine was offline anyways. They completely disregard the threat in the threat model that insiders are a problem or a security threat. So they apparently fully trust their developers or try to put protocols in place so that trust is never centralized on a single developer. I'm skeptical of this. This evaluation was limited to the voting machines, but we have plenty of other things to evaluate as well. This is not sufficient. I described this very serious vulnerability in the vote shuffling mechanism pertaining to ballot secrecy, but we also found problems in ballot integrity. So all the voting machines have internal memories, and they receive software from flashcards. All these medias, they actually have an encrypted partition. And this encrypted partition stores the most critical data of the system, which is the voting software and the signing key. So if we have a private key, for example, to sign the poll tape, it's stored in the encrypted partition. And this makes sense, right? These are critical data. They must be stored on a protected place. The problem is, instead of finding a way to store the encryption key of this partition in a secure device or hardware security module, they just hard-coded the keys in the source code, which means that 500,000 voting machines share the same key. If this key leaks once, you can attack a machine in any other place in the country. It's essentially the same key. And since it's in the source code, it's obviously in plain text in the cards which install the voting software. So perhaps it can be recovered from those cards. We also found out that to check, the voting machine software tries to check if it was tampered. It was manipulated through some mechanism. But the way they designed this was, again, deeply flawed. The voting software checks its own hashes to conclude if it has been manipulated or not, which you can conclude it makes no sense from the point of view of security. So the conclusion at that time was that the system did not fulfill the basic requirements of both ballot secrecy or integrity. In 2014, the Electoral Authority decided to not hold another hacking challenge event. They claimed that the system was already approved, of course, because they approved the system, so they decided to not have an edition of public security tests. But we had a third edition of this in 2016. This was, we got some advances in a few regards, but some bad trade-offs in others. So in this following event, the scope was extended to more components of the system. So the system which builds the flashcards, for example, was under inspection. Investigators could access this, but still fingerprinting devices and transmission of results were out of scope. Probably the most worrying thing on this specific edition was the introduction of a mandatory NDA, which forbid anyone participating from sharing any of the information collected during the event. So, of course, this was incompatible with my function as a public servant. I teach at a Brazilian university. So my job is not to keep secrets from the electoral authority, right? It's to inform the public about the real security of such a system. So I only participated as an external observer to try to help the investigators to accomplish their tasks. Because, you know, there are so many restrictions, and if you can have someone on the field trying to help them relieve some of this, they might be more productive. But still, vulnerabilities were found in this edition of the tests. Two main vulnerabilities I think are worth discussing. Another vulnerability in ballot secrecy was found by students and researchers from the University of Taubaté in Brazil. They found out that if the poll worker enabled votes, the accessibility mechanism, which means that the voting machine would play all the keys being pressed in the headphone jack, and if they had something inserted there, they could capture all the keys being pressed, which is enough to break ballot secrecy again for all the voters. This is interesting, but I think the more interesting attack found on that edition of the test was against ballot integrity, and this time a researcher called Sergio Freitas actually mounted an attack using this vulnerability. So the system works like this. If you have some problem with the voting machine during the elections, it stops working, for example, you might be able to get a partial result in a poll tape, and you have to manually type the results on another system. This other system, of course, needs to check if these results are correct or not. So the poll tape has checksums. Every 2 or 3 set of results, you have a new checksum. And this software will check if the checksums are correct to see if this poll worker typing the data, the results, is manipulating them or not. But then he found out that the way this checksum was computed did not involve any secrets. So if you knew how this function was computed, you could simply change the results and compute the corresponding checksum, and the system would accept this blindly. So it was the first ever attack experimentally demonstrated against ballot integrity in the Brazilian system. So the problem we have is we have inherently vulnerable equipment because it runs software, right? Voting systems run software. Software is inherently vulnerable. You need to find a way to still have accurate outcomes from these voting systems in the presence of vulnerabilities. So many countries attempted different ways of solving this problem or mitigating this problem. I will talk about a few of those. Mexico, in the province of Jalisco, is prototyping this system. As you can see on the left-hand side of the machine, you have like a repository for paper ballots. On the right-hand side, you have a touch screen. So the voter picks his options in the right-hand side, and a ballot will be printed on the left-hand side. The voter checks if this matches his choices or not, and he's able to accept or refuse this paper ballot. At the end of the day, you can count perhaps a random sample of these paper ballots to check if the electronic count was accurate or not. But the problem arises if there are mismatching records, because you have to decide which has higher priority. Is it the paper record, which was verified by a certain fraction of the voters, or was the electronic vote, the electronic count? You have to decide. You need a protocol to decide about these ambiguities. So this is in place in Mexico. Venezuela has a different but similar in some regard system. The difference from Mexico is that in Venezuela, the voters actually have physical contact to their ballots to deposit on a conventional ballot box, which opens this against other types of attacks like switching votes or some kind of voter coercion, which is problematic. And I also love this picture because, as you can see in the right-hand side, it's where the voters take their choices. And it's a little too dark to see, but there are 14 copies of Maduro's picture there. The reason is Maduro represented a coalition of 14, yeah, thanks, that helps. So Maduro represented a coalition of 14 parties. That's why he appears much more frequently than the other candidates. And it's funny that even if you do this, he has a higher chance of winning, right? Or receiving a vote. India is also experimenting with paper records since 2014, after Alex Halderman and Hari Prasad demonstrated very serious vulnerabilities against their system. So they're trying to introduce paper records in a similar way as Mexico for verifying or auditing in case of a dispute or checking that the electronic record is correct. Of course, there is the Argentinian system, right, which tries to make this for individual ballots, but you know way more about the Argentinian system than myself. What I know about the Argentinian system that it's actually not a printer, it's a computer. But that's kind of obvious, right? That's kind of obvious. So perhaps the best cost benefit resides on the systems used in some portions of the US. We call it optical scanners. You just fill the blanks in a ballot. The ballots go through this fairly simple system with small pieces of software to check if the blanks were filled or not. So some advantages are, we completely understand this technology. We use it for other applications like entrance exams at universities and any kind of public exam. The software can be much simpler than the whole touch screen with lots of accessibility features. You can do manual recounts if you need. You have ballots filled by the voters. You have no ambiguity. There is only a single record performed by the voter that can be counted in different ways. So perhaps this is the best cost benefit out there. It would be, if you assume that you need electronic voting, perhaps this is the best way to go forward. So the current problems we still have in Brazil. For our purposes, software is still secret. A tiny fraction of the population is able to access the source code, to inspect the source code of the system by participating in these hacking challenges or by being appointed by political parties. But for the overwhelming majority of the population, the source code is still secret. And this system has been in place for more than 20 years. So it's impressive that we have voted with unauditable software for so long. The software was demonstrated to be insecure in several occasions, both in terms of ballot secrecy and ballot integrity. We have no paper record for recounts, which means we have no effective means to audit the system. We have to blindly trust the electoral authority to conclude that the elections were fair. If we trust them, elections were fair. If you don't trust them, well, perhaps you have a dispute with the result, but no way to verify what's the correct outcome. Conflicts of interest everywhere, as you can see. Due to the centralization by the electoral authority, we have plenty of conflicts of interest in the way the system is evaluated as well, as I presented evidence. And insider attacks are completely disregarded, which means that someone inside the electoral authority is able probably to manipulate a large fraction of the voting machines without means for detection, which is very disturbing. What can we do? We shouldn't be discouraged about these problems. We should try to find ways around them and to improve the situation. So things we can attempt. Introduce paper records so you can have audits and recounts again. Perhaps open source the software, which is not sufficient, right? Just having open source software doesn't solve problems. It only helps with improving the quality of software, but it's still terribly hard to verify that the software you inspected before the elections actually was executed during the election day. This is a highly non-trivial problem. So, but it's good for transparency and for improving the overall state of the software with time. And we need improved means for social control. So we experimented with such a mechanism in 2014, the year that the electoral authority decided to not hold public tests, in a project called You Inspect, or Você Fiscal in Portuguese. So the idea was, we instructed voters to go to the poll places and take pictures of the poll tapes that are fixated at the poll places and transmit them to our server. At our server, we extracted the information from these pictures, the voting totals, to verify if they matched the public electronic records published afterwards by the electoral authority. Of course, this was very challenging because we had to do image processing and OCR, and complex computational tasks to match those together. But we still, after a last step of manual checking, we could still verify the transmission of 4.1% of the votes. Notice that we were only verifying that the poll tapes printed by the machines matched the records received by the electoral authority. This says nothing about if these poll tapes were accurate or not, if they matched voter intention or not. But, well, transmitting partial results is also a place where the attacker can mount fraud, so it's important to verify that as well. So in total, we had 8,000 poll tapes, 100 gigabytes in pictures. But the conclusion was, these pictures or this participation was very concentrated on the large cities, which raises questions about the quality of our sample. It's really hard to get a statistically significant sample for such a large country. So it's still a challenge on the way forward to design some sampling process that allow us to verify a presidential election, for example. And this is just the transmission part, which should be easier to verify because it's more transparent. We can verify paper poll tapes and electronic records published by the electoral authority. One thing that is good in that regard is that the electoral authority adopted QR codes for the poll tapes, which makes it much easier to at least extract the information from there. So you need no image processing or OCR in the process, you just need to read these QR codes. But this is still a formidable task to do this in the scale of Brazil and with a statistically significant result. So I've been involved in this for 5 years, and we still have many current problems to solve, but I try to be positive. We made some progress, and I think it's good to provide some future perspective. So in 2015, right after the presidential elections, the losing party asked for an audit. And this took several months. They audited different portions of the system. They inspected the source code a little again. They also verified the sample of the poll tapes and the electronic records to see if they matched for the transmission part. But the interesting thing was they concluded that the system could not be audited. So it was fairly inconclusive audit, right? So, but I still think this was useful because although this was well known in the technical community, it's good to have a major political party attesting to this conclusion because this might help drive change in the system. As I told you, the electoral authority implemented QR codes in these poll tapes, so verifying the transmission is slightly easier, but still hard to do in the scale you need for statistical significance. There will be another edition of the public tests in November this year, and I will lead the team again participating in this, because after lots of pressure, they made the NDA much less restrictive. Instead of forbidding anyone from publishing their findings, now they only require you to notify them first before you speak publicly about a vulnerability or some security issue you found in this system, which I find it more reasonable. Ideally, there would be no NDA, right? This is a public system funded by public money, and we are behaving or applying the public interest when participating on this, so there shouldn't be any NDAs. But, well, if there has to be an NDA, preferably is a less restrictive one. And more recently, Congress approved a law which mandates reintroduction of paper records for the next elections. The electoral authority decided to do this only in 5% of the voting machines, which is fairly small. I prefer 10, perhaps, or 15% for a first experiment. But at least there is something changing. And we might be able to understand and figure out what's the best way of introducing a paper record in a system which must work at such a scale. So I can give you 2 lessons I found after working in this for the past 5 years. First, you need to fix your paper ballot elections before you move to electronic voting, because it might be really hard to either go back to paper ballots or to introduce paper records. We have been trying in Brazil for 20 years to get this done, and we are still only down to 5% of the voting machines having paper records in the next elections if the law does not change in the meantime. The electoral authority has been pushing for changes in the law, so this might be even reverted before the next elections. And also the fairly obvious lesson that elections need not only to appear fair, but they have to provide actual means for independent verification. This is actually the most important property of any election. It's not how fast the counting, the tallying is done, and the result is published. But if we can convince the losing party that they actually lost, because we have evidence that can be verified towards this outcome. So all these findings are documented in these two publications. Feel free to take a look. The first one talks about the software vulnerabilities we found and our participation in these public security tests. And the second one documents the experience with trying to verify the transmission of results. With this, I finish my talk for the time being. Thanks a lot for the opportunity of being here and for your attention. I may answer questions if we have time for questions. Yes, we have time for questions. Do we have questions? So the question I got was, based on my knowledge, was there fraud in the past presidential election? I don't know. There's no means to verify. So I can't tell. And the past election was fairly important because it was the first time we had such a close outcome. So this actually helped a lot, the case of having a verifiable voting system, a transparent voting system, because people quickly realized that in the future, we will have perhaps even closer elections. The whole country is polarized between two political parties. Results will be closer and closer. We need a way to verify the outcome is correct. So I can't say if there was fraud or not. There is no evidence towards any direction, but at least it was important for that, to make the case of verifiable elections stronger. More questions? So I think I get the question is a question that I get fairly frequent. I got this exact same question in the backstage. Can blockchains help? Essentially, can we do elections with a blockchain? The problem with this reasoning is blockchains are built for transparency. So they don't have the security requirements we need for ballot secrecy, for example. Right? So you need extra things on top of your blockchain to prevent like leaking metadata that might link the voter to his vote or any other information that can be used to break ballot secrecy. So there are a few systems described in the research literature that try to do small-scale elections for using blockchains, but they don't scale for a presidential election. And also there is another strong reason. If you want to vote through the blockchain, record individual votes in the blockchain, you probably want some kind of internet voting system, which opens another can of worms. Now you have the internet between voters and votes. You have to secure the terminals, otherwise malware could vote for you. So you have lots of new problems that you didn't have with offline voting systems, either through ballots or some kind of optical scanner. So I don't think blockchains are a good mechanism for designing voting systems, but they can be good for transmitting results, for example. You could do like an election in a place, and then after you count the votes, you could transmit this, put this immediately on a blockchain. So it's trivial for anyone to do a parallel tally of the votes. So I think blockchains have a place, but not recording individual votes. Some blockchains provide secrecy guarantees. So take a look at Zcash, for example, the anonymous cryptocurrency. Perhaps this is a starting point for someone willing to design such a system. But beware that there are problems. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Yes. The examples you gave are probably, except the US, a single voting machine for the entire election. Do you think it's better or worse or any different if there were different implementations of the same voting system by different vendors or different machines that interoperate?
Competition is always good, right? So I think having an open market where different companies or universities, whatever, they propose systems or different implementations of the same system and they get to compete to put this in production is a good thing. A fairly bad thing about the the organization of the Brazilian elections is the government provides the machines and decides what machines to use. So we have no competition. We just have to convince them to implement some change if we can make enough pressure. I don't think this is good for the long-term health of the system. So yes, having competition is good, and open market is better than a centralized, autocratic situation just like we have in Brazil. Do we have more questions? So the QR code stores the results from that poll tape. So it makes it easier for you to, while at the polling place, to extract the result printed by the machine and store it in your phone. And then 3 days after, when the electoral authority publishes per polling place results, so they publish CSV files with results across the whole country, you can verify that what you capture during right after the end of the voting session matches what was published. So it's just a mean to verify that the transmission was accurate, just for the transmission part, which is also important, right? Because this is another very tempting place to attack for a well-equipped adversary. Thank you. Still more questions? I see one hand at least. I can see hands in the back. So there is a question there. Have no time? Okay. So thanks a lot for the attention. I believe we will have a panel right in 15 minutes or so. Probably we can discuss this more there. Thanks a lot.